All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm very glad to see you again. This is going to be our last class for this particular part of our series. I know, but Donna is not here, but I will just speak on her behalf because we've had a few conversations about this. I'm only going to get up to about 1964-65 today. And so, with that in mind, still a lot to cover after that. We're going to do another series in the spring. Yay! And so, yes.
That does not happen in a
Well, thank you, and hopefully we'll have something more concrete coming, but I would imagine it'll probably be a little bit later in the spring, but we'll keep you posted, and it will likely be another 3-class series, and will hopefully bring us right into the 21st century, so stay on the lookout for that. Okay, so today, finishing up this part of our series, we're going to go from roughly about 1885, we are still in the 1880s, but we're going to move pretty quickly today, and we're going to get up to about 1964, 1965. And so our focus today is going to be on what we're going to call the rise and fall of Jim Crow in Jacksonville. Now, if you don't remember what Jim Crow was, I will talk a little bit about that today, but in a sense, we are talking about a nearly century-long effort, a kind of civil rights movement, to restore the dreams and hopes of the generation of people who came up during Reconstruction, who were trying to create this novel thing in world history that no other nation on earth had ever done other than the United States, that is to create a biracial democracy. And we're going to find out today that that dream dies in Jacksonville by the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it's then going to take a civil rights movement to kind of resurrect it in the 1960s, at least the beginning of that. So that's kind of our trajectory for today. But if we could, I'd like to begin in prayer. Dear God, thank you for allowing us to gather once again as a church family and a community to reflect and learn about our shared history. And we ask that it will be a guiding light for us today in the present. We are so, so grateful, and we thank you in your name. Amen. Okay, so one of the themes I want to highlight and reiterate again, and it's one we've really picked up with since the very first class, and that is, though today I will be talking about what on the surface is a political movement or political conflict, we always want to keep in mind that front and center for many people involved in this is their religious faith, their Christianity, and in some cases their Presbyterianism. And so I don't want that lost as we're looking at something that could very easily be seen as merely politics. We go back to very first class and we said that particularly for many people in the nation, black and white, particularly for formerly enslaved people, the Civil War was literally an apocalyptic event. It was a kind of divine judgment, a revelation of God's will, and therefore Reconstruction became an attempt to fulfill God's will. It was seen almost universally within particularly the black church, but also some elements of the white church. So many northern Christian missionaries, Methodists and Presbyterians are coming to Jacksonville, not merely to do political or educational work, to fulfill their role as disciples of Christ. And so we always want to be mindful of that central role that religious faith is going to play in what on the surface looks like a political movement. And you're going to see that today. And so just keep in mind, even into the late 1960s, the role of the church is going to be fundamental to the civil rights movement. And indeed, some historians have argued in recent years that a better way to understand the civil rights movement in America, and that can go back to Reconstruction or it can be after World War II, is that it's kind of a religious revival movement. We don't think of it that way, but in many ways it was, and you'll see some of that coming through today. Before I begin, because this is our last class, and some of you might want to do some additional reading if you're interested in anything I've talked about, I want to just call your attention to 3 books. and let you know that you can get all these. They're all published by the University Press of Florida. If you want to use Amazon, they're all available on Amazon. But this book on the left here is called To Render Invisible: Jim Crow and Public Life in New South Jacksonville. That's a book that goes from about 1865 up to about 1900. I will just caution you that this book is written in a way that my students don't like it because it's written in a way that's really geared towards other professors. Not all of it. There's a lot of fascinating information in that book you won't get anywhere else. But just know it is not maybe the most enjoyable read in terms of the writing style, but there's really good, important content. The other two books I would draw your attention to are by Jim Crooks, a former UNF professor. Jim was at some of our classes in the spring, and Jim was a member of Lakewood Presbyterian Church on the south side, which is where I grew up. And Jim was not only a model for me as an historian, he helped navigate my applications and desires to go to graduate school for history, but Jim took his Christian faith and lived it in the community, getting involved in a number of different causes that were incredibly inspiring to me. And so, nevertheless, despite that personal connection, Jim has written two really good books about Jacksonville. One, After the Fire, Jacksonville After the Fire, 1901 to 1919, that talks a little bit about some of what we'll address today with the rise of Jim Crow in Jacksonville. And then this book, Jacksonville, the consolidation story from civil rights to the Jaguars. That's another really good book, and we'll touch on some topics that are in there. So if you want to go into more depth, those are the three I would recommend. Okay, so where we left off last time, we were talking about Jacksonville as a city that had a really remarkable reputation in the 1870s and 1880s. We were known as the cosmopolitan city of the South. And that was because we had an incredibly diverse population. We had a substantial northern-born population that was here with a majority southern-born population. We had a fairly large immigrant population for a city in the Deep South. And in addition to that, we had a political system here in Jacksonville that by the 1880s was really standing out because you had a city council by the mid-1880s and the late 1880s. That was made up primarily of black men, a minority of white men. You had a police force in Jacksonville that was made up of a majority of black men, and that was in part because Jacksonville's population was nearly 60% black, and so it was reflective of the city's demographics. But whereas other cities had begun to transition away from this Reconstruction experiment in a biracial democracy, it was holding on in Jacksonville to a remarkable degree. And so where we're going to pick up now is how that ends. I'm going to be brief about that, and then talk about what follows, which is known as the Jim Crow era. So I finished last time by talking about the creation of something known as the 1885 Constitution. Now, if we go back 2 weeks when we were talking about, last week I should say, we're talking about Reconstruction, and a man named Jonathan Gibbs, a Presbyterian pastor, educated at Princeton Theological Seminary, was once a Presbyterian minister at Black Presbyterian Church in New York and then in Philadelphia. He leaves Philadelphia in 1867 to come to Jacksonville to be a part of this religious and political movement here during Reconstruction. And so he sets up a private school that is Presbyterian-informed private school, but he's also getting involved in politics. Jonathan Gibbs is part of the creation of the 1868 Constitution in Florida that basically is transitioning Florida from a state controlled by all-white Democrats into a state that is going to be something resembling a biracial democracy, a new constitution that not only guarantees political freedom, particularly for black men, and allowing them to vote, it's going to set up the state's first public school system. And Jonathan Gibbs, if we recall, is not only going to help create this new constitution that creates a public school system. He then, later in the 1870s, is going to be superintendent of public instruction, creating a vast expansion of the public school system in Florida where one had not existed really before. Well, fast forward to 1885, and Florida passes a new constitution that creates a poll tax designed to begin removing voters from the rolls. These beliefs that Reconstruction had been an era of corruption, of political corruption, orchestrated by these Northern Republicans coming to the South and enfranchising, giving the vote to people who were unqualified to vote and knew nothing about the way democracies work. In politics, this argument went, had become corrupt. And so how do you begin to remove corruption? You begin to remove people from exercising the right to vote. And the poll tax had that purpose. It was one way. Democrats in Tallahassee, and we need to remember when I use political language and political parties today, throw out what you think you know about what political parties stand for and represent in the 21st century and what they were in the 19th century. It just does not work. You have to let that go and take another American history class to see how that evolves over time. I don't have time to do that. I don't want to wade into those waters either. But just for argument's sake, though, today, it was Democrats in Tallahassee who were saying, get the federal government out of the business of telling us what to do. We're going to run our own affairs here in Florida and in Jacksonville, and we're going to do that by cleaning up politics, and then we're going to do that by stripping certain people of their right to vote, poll tax. 1885 Constitution mandates public education be segregated by law. Anyone who violates that is violating the law in Florida. 1885 Constitution bans interracial marriage until 1967. So a very different constitution than existed and was created in 1868 with Jonathan Gibbs. And one of the major critics of this new constitution is Jonathan Gibbs' son, Thomas Gibbs. Thomas Gibbs has also moved to Jacksonville. He is also a Presbyterian, and he, like his father, is a representative in Tallahassee at this constitutional convention. There are still black representatives in Tallahassee debating this new constitution, and Thomas Gibbs is one of the representatives from Jacksonville. And he gets up and gives an impassioned argument against the undemocratic nature of the poll tax, the immorality of the poll tax, the immorality of segregation, the immorality of passing a law denying the right of a mixed-race couple to get married. And so he is, again, kind of the voice of conscience. And again, I want to emphasize that connection to the Presbyterian Church. Now, in 1887, despite this happening in Jacksonville, that is, despite this new state constitution, Jacksonville by 1887 still has substantial voter participation from black and white Republicans. Primarily African Americans are Republicans. There's a small number of whites who are Republicans. Overwhelmingly whites in the South are Democrat. But Jacksonville, we need to remember again, in 1887, 60% of the city is black. And so voters who still are able to vote despite the poll tax are still voting people into city council who are Republican, who are black, and in some cases who are white and associated with this kind of third party that grows out of the Democratic Party. It's made up mostly of working people who are angry that the elites are controlling the government and that they want working people to have a voice. Well, in 1887, Jacksonville has a city council, once again, that is made up primarily of black Republicans, a handful of white working class Labor Party people, and it has the president of the city council, John Spearing, who I've talked about before. John Spearing, the son of Samuel Spearing. John Spearing, born into slavery like his father. And so this is what Jacksonville looks like in 1887. But the next year, a major turning point in our city's history. We have an outbreak of yellow fever. Yellow fever epidemics were devastating in America in the 18th and 19th centuries. Northern cities like Philadelphia repeatedly in the 1790s were just hammered by these terrible outbreaks of yellow fever. In particular, and also in southern cities that were close to marshes and rivers that had dense mosquito populations, yellow fever could oftentimes outbreak in the summer into the early fall. And Jacksonville experienced a devastating yellow fever outbreak in 1888. Indeed, nearly 3% of the city's population dies in that yellow fever outbreak. Now, why is this relevant? Well, during the yellow fever outbreak, many people fled Jacksonville. Many people would always flee cities during disease epidemics because disease epidemics spread quicker in cities. And so Jacksonville's population, both black and white, kind of shrank in the city. But city leaders, the mayor of Jacksonville, who was at the time himself a Republican, and many of the city council leaders, they also left the city. And so the city, it was argued, was not being effectively led by its political leaders. They had seemingly left to protect themselves and not run the city. That was a bit of an exaggeration, but that was the accusation. And that accusation was used by white Democrats in Jacksonville and in Tallahassee to say, Jacksonville has no government, they have no political leadership, and we are going to use the power of the state to basically dissolve Jacksonville's government. And so what happens in 1889, that's the House, the legislature in Tallahassee passes a bill that says, we are taking over Jacksonville politics. We're going to select who Jacksonville's mayor is. Not the voters of Jacksonville, we've disenfranchised them. We are going to pick Jacksonville's mayor and we're going to pick their city council for them. So what happens is that Tallahassee chooses a Democratic mayor, and they then create a city council that has a Democratic supermajority. There are still 2 or 3 black city councilmen left, but that is the beginning of this transition because it was recognized, and again, this was the pretext. Yellow fever epidemic was kind of a pretext because Tallahassee realized unless we take concerted action, the demographics of Jacksonville will always allow for there to be the possibility of a black majority city council and possibly even a Republican mayor. We cannot have this in Florida's biggest city, and so the state comes in and unilaterally dissolves government in Jacksonville and installs a democratic regime. And it will not be until 1993, 2 or 3, I can't remember, Ed Austin, if you were in Jacksonville, Ed Austin will be the next Republican mayor in Jacksonville. It'll be until the 1990s. That is how long that the consequences of that will be. Again, put aside all of our snap judgments and prejudices about what parties mean, but that's the reality. That's what happened. So what does this mean? Well, it means now that Jacksonville is beginning to enter into this new Jim Crow era. It's not only going to be the poll tax. It's not only going to be that the state legislature in Tallahassee basically is saying, okay, this is what we want now for Jacksonville. We're done with this Reconstruction stuff. Even if we have to take matters into our own hands, even when we have to strip Jacksonville voters of their own political voice, we are ending Reconstruction in Jacksonville, and we're doing it with the pretext that it's because we had no political leadership during the yellow fever epidemic. Now, this is what the state then does. The state goes further. In a few years, the state will pass what was called a primary law. And the point of this 1901 primary law was to say black voters in the state of Florida can no longer participate in primary elections. They can vote in general elections, but they cannot participate in primary elections. Well, what was the point of that? The point of that was, in effect, that the state understood that whoever is elected in a primary election eventually becomes the presumptive nominee for a general election. And in a state that was dominated by the Democratic Party, if you could not have a voice in choosing who the primary candidate would be, you basically have no voice in choosing who the ultimate candidate will be. And so it creates a system known as the all-white primary. In addition to that, and it will be 1944 when the Supreme Court rules that unconstitutional. In 1907, the state once again gets involved in Jacksonville politics. In 1907, there is still one black city council member. 1907, still sitting on Jacksonville City Council. There's a possibility there could be a couple more coming on if election happens fairly quickly. And so the state of Florida says, okay, we're going to gerrymander council districts in Jacksonville, and we're going to redraw them in such a way that guarantees no black city councilman will be elected. Regardless of how many black voters turn out, we're going to draw them in such a way as that there will always be a white majority in each council district. And so in 1907, the last black city council member, the last vestige of this Reconstruction dream of a biracial democracy, is voted out of office. He's forced out of office. And it will be 60 years, it will be not until 1967 that Jacksonville once again has representation from its black community on city council. So it will be, again, this is going to take a decades-long civil rights movement. Now, what we need to understand is that this was a celebration in Jacksonville. This goes back to this old idea that Reconstruction was a mistake. It was political corruption at its worst. It was an orchestration. It was an artificial attempt by men of one political party and the radical wing of one political party to use the federal government to tell us how to live our lives. And that is not the way things should be. The natural order of things needs to be restored. And many people, particularly associated with the all-white Democratic Party at the time, they used religious language. They used the language of redemption. They talked about redeeming Jacksonville, redeeming Florida, redeeming the South, and many call themselves redeemers. The sin, they pointed out, was Reconstruction. This dark, dark effort, this dark era in which the bottom rail was on top, in which the federal government was telling us how to live our lives here in the South, in which political corruption ran rampant. That was the argument. We're cleaning up politics and we're redeeming our political system and we're restoring the natural order. All of what had happened in Reconstruction was artificial. What we are restoring is the natural order of our society, what our ancestors preserved, and that was lost in the Civil War and Reconstruction. So I'll draw your attention to this editorial in the Jacksonville Metropolis. For those who grew up in Jacksonville, you might remember an afternoon paper known as the Jacksonville Journal. That went away, I think, in the late 80s. This is the predecessor of the Jacksonville Journal. And so we had two dailies during the early 20th century, the Times-Union and the Metropolis, and they politically were basically on the same. Times-Union might have been a little more conservative than the Metropolis, but this is what the Metropolis says. The Metropolis, again, 1907, after the state's gerrymandering law, the Metropolis congratulates the people of Jacksonville upon having elected for the first time in many years a full white city council. It marks a new era in the hope that a better feeling will exist in the council than did last year. I'll also call your attention to the scripture at the top, Psalm 56. I don't think they intended there to be such irony between the message in the editorial and then the decision to have the scripture of the day be Psalm 56, which says, "Be merciful unto me, O God." It was, of course, the paper's having daily scripture there, but nevertheless, I found that really kind of fascinating, that pairing of the message of the editorial and then the use of Psalms. But even though they don't use the language of redemption, the implication there is that Jacksonville has been redeemed, and many, many other people use that explicit language of redemption to talk about this process of doing away with Reconstruction and establishing a new era. All right, so in Jacksonville, this new era also manifests itself in different ways. And I'm going to talk now about the implementation of segregation laws in Jacksonville. So we've talked about how Reconstruction, the political Reconstruction, has been overthrown. This new era of redemption, or Jim Crow, has come into being, and that's really being orchestrated at the state level. So what does it look like in the city of Jacksonville? What are the laws that are being passed in Jacksonville? And I want to focus on the first segregation laws that get passed in the state and in Jacksonville are in public transportation. Trains and then streetcars. This is where you begin to see Jim Crow outside of politics being instituted, and this will help us understand what later generations of civil rights activists were trying to protest against. What they were trying to get outlawed were the very laws that were being passed in Florida during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and in Jacksonville. So first I want to start with trains here very briefly. In the 1880s, when Florida, and particularly Jacksonville, was still controlled by the vestiges of this Reconstruction coalition, in the 1880s, really from the Civil War to the 1880s, there was no legal segregation on trains or streetcars in Florida or in Jacksonville, or indeed really anywhere in the South. That is, segregation may have occurred, and some train companies might have taken the initiative to say, we have an interest in segregating our riders, but it was not law. It was up to the owners of a particular train company or a particular streetcar company. But we'll see how that changes in just a little bit. The only thing by Florida law that was segregated in the 1880s was its public school system. Otherwise, it was up to the proprietor, the business person, whether or not they chose to segregate or not. Well, this comes to an head in the 1880s. I'm going to give you one example, and it is going to be one that involves the AME Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne, a man who was born free in Charleston, South Carolina in 1811. He basically becomes the leader of the Black AME Church, and he is in Jacksonville helping build the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the city. He's traveling from Jacksonville to Fernandina one day. 1881, he takes a train, it leaves Jacksonville, and just before they get out of the city, the train conductor realizes that Bishop Payne is sitting next to another white pastor, a white Methodist pastor, and they're friends, and they're sitting next to one another on a train. And this particular conductor says, on my train, black people have to ride in the smoker, the smoking car, the second-class car that was mostly reserved for men who chose to smoke or chew tobacco and spit that tobacco into spittoons and use bad language. Women didn't sit in the smoking car, but men did, or men who wanted to participate in that kind of behavior, or black people sat in the smoking car. Well, Bishop Payne was sitting in a first-class car and sitting next to a white friend. The conductor tells him he has to get out of his seat and go to the smoker. And Bishop Payne, rather than consenting to that, which he saw as an indignity, which he saw as wrong and immoral, he says, I will not go to the smoking car, but instead I will get out of this train and I will walk back to Jacksonville rather than ride on your train. And this is what Bishop Payne said in his memoirs during this time. Where did I go? Hang on one second. I've lost my seat. Here we go. Bishop Payne said, I have traveled over many portions of foreign lands and found no such treatment. I also came from Baltimore to Jacksonville having no trouble, and I want to know if white men riding between Jacksonville and Fernandina are somehow better than white men elsewhere. All the while Bishop Payne was being removed from the train, half the train's riders, not all of them, but half of them, white riders, stood up and started chanting, shame, 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 at the conductor who was forcing Payne off the train. Now, this would have been something that would have been unthinkable in 10 or 20 years, that half the riders who were white would yell shame, shame, shame at the removal of a black man from a first-class seat. But at this time, before segregation had been firmly rooted in the law, there were people who did not grow up in an era where the trains were necessarily segregated. So this was a remarkable event, and they expressed their outrage. But by 1887, just a few years after this particular instance, the state of Florida passes a law saying all trains must be segregated. So 2 years after that new constitution that creates segregated public schools, the state of Florida passes a constitution segregating trains. Now in Jacksonville, this leads us into streetcars. Oh, and really quick, I oftentimes show this image to my students. This is Union Terminal, Jacksonville, 1921. This is the black section of Union Terminal. Does anyone know or recognize where this photograph was taken? Corley?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been in the terminal and there's this great big waiting room.
Absolutely. And what is that terminal today? Prime Osborne Convention Center. So this is the Prime Osborne, and yes, they still hold events here, and here is the consequence of the law in 1887 that will persist until the 1950s. All right, so in Jacksonville, we see its first segregation law occurring on streetcars. So my students are always very curious, why are some of the very first legal segregation laws on trains and streetcars? Before there are other forms of legalized segregation, we are seeing this on trains and streetcars. And I will just very briefly say, everyone needed access to public transportation, whether that was on the railroad or in a city like Jacksonville that was increasingly becoming a suburban city. If you were going to get to Riverside, if you're going to get to La Villa, if you're going to get to Springfield, rather than walking in the summer heat, you take these new electric streetcars that took you straight into the city.
And the streets are sand.
Yes, the streets are not yet quite all paved yet, so it's hard walking. It's clearly the preferred mode of transportation. So you're bringing together people who, out of necessity, who need to ride transportation. But trains and streetcars are enclosed spaces. They kind of force a level of intimacy. You're bumping shoulders with people that you don't know, with strangers. Sometimes you're sitting next to people you don't know. And that forced intimacy raised all kinds of questions. It was also a question about, well, where do people sit? And if someone sat in a front seat, did that make them in some ways superior to someone who sat behind them? And so when you were talking about seating placement, you were also talking about hierarchies in society. So they raised all of these kinds of questions. Well, in Jacksonville's first streetcars, we begin to see them in the 1880s. But by the early 1900s, right before the fire, they are becoming all more common, more and more riders. And the question about what to do on streetcars reaches a fever pitch after the fire. The city is rebuilding itself. New people are moving into Jacksonville. Jacksonville is yet to segregate its streetcars. But in 1901, there is a tragic case where a young black boy was riding one of these streetcars, and in the summer they were open air. There was no windows. He is riding in one of these streetcars, and he was seated close to a white woman. A man walking down the street was carrying a gun, saw this, pulled out the gun, and killed the black boy while he was riding in the streetcar. This leads to fury. It even leads to something akin to a riot in the city of Jacksonville. And the city of Jacksonville says, okay, we can't have violence on our streetcars, so we are going to pass a law that says white people and black people cannot sit next to one another on streetcars. We're not going to create segregated sections, but we're going to mandate by law whites and blacks cannot sit next to one another. This brings out the black church once again. Pastors from a cross-section of denominations, Presbyterian, AME, Baptist, come to city council. They write petitions that are published in papers protesting this as immoral. But it remains the law until 1905, and there are more instances of violence on streetcars. And this is what the state and later the city of Jacksonville say. There's so much tension, there's so much friction, we need laws that do away with that tension and friction. And in 1905, Jacksonville passes a law that formally segregates people riding on streetcars in the city of Jacksonville, and that segregated public transportation in Jacksonville will persist again until the 1950s into the 1960s. Here, if you can't read it, is an example of ministers once again protesting this new Jim Crow law in Jacksonville. It is called the iniquitous Jim Crow streetcar law, and here are a number of pastors. J. Milton Waldron, the main author of this petition, was the new pastor at Bethel Baptist Church. And if we go back to our earlier class, we saw Bethel Baptist Church emerging as a center of black religious and political life. And J. Milton Waldron was carrying on that tradition, and that will persist as well into the 1960s. It wasn't just streetcars and trains, though, that were being segregated in Jacksonville. By the 1880s, we are seeing the growth of railroad lines connecting Jacksonville with the beach. We are seeing the birth of Pablo Beach, what becomes Jacksonville Beach. And then in the early 20th century, we're seeing the development of Atlantic Beach. And as the beach's population grows, this is a question not only about transportation to the beach, but who has access to the beach and to the ocean. And these questions are going to be, like the trains and streetcars, based upon local preference, based upon just habit and custom. You kind of know which beach you should go to if you're white or black. But as the population grows, we're going to see that change. One thing I would bring to your attention here is what happens in Atlantic Beach. And some of y'all might be familiar with this history. 1900, Henry Flagler. We won't go into the long history of Henry Flagler, but the railroad magnate who was basically using the railroads to open up Florida to settlement, to business, to tourism. He wants to establish a brand new hotel here in Northeast Florida, and in 1900, Flagler begins construction on what becomes known as the Continental Hotel in Atlantic Beach, which was basically between 7th and 10th Streets in Atlantic Beach. And the people who helped build the railroad line that connected Jacksonville with Pablo Beach, and then Pablo Beach, Jacksonville Beach with Atlantic Beach, almost all of the workers who did that work and then who helped build the Continental Railroad were black. But black workers could not, of course, enjoy the hotel, nor could they enjoy the beach out in front of the Continental Hotel. So Flagler, in a gesture of gratitude to black workers, bought land a few miles to the north in what is today Hanna Park and set that land aside for black workers at the beach who otherwise could not enjoy the beach in Atlantic Beach. And that beach became known as Manhattan Beach. Before there was American Beach in Nassau County, Manhattan Beach becomes basically the first beach reserved for black people so they could enjoy the sand and the ocean. This Continental Hotel will basically burn down and eventually fold in the early 20th century. But here are the railroad lines. This is Jacksonville. This was the railroad line connecting Jacksonville, basically what is Beach Boulevard, helping to establish Pablo, now Jacksonville Beach. And then the Florida East Coast Railroad going north into Atlantic Beach and to Mayport. Flagler used Mayport as a kind of coaling station to get coal for his railroad building efforts elsewhere in the state. And so here you had then the Continental Hotel very close to an important port at Mayport. And then here in Hanna Park becomes what is today Hanna Park, Manhattan Beach. Jacksonville Beach, by 1924, Jacksonville Beach passes a law banning black people from coming to the beach and enjoying the ocean. And that will be the case for the next 40 years. So here we have a situation where, again, it's not a public transportation facility, it's not a hotel, it's not a park, it's not a library. It's nature that has been segregated. And this always goes hand in hand with more and more population growth. The more population, the more possibility of interracial contact, particularly in intimate settings such as the beach, when people are not always dressed as fully maybe as they would be. Do away with that temptation, do away with that problem by segregating the beach and the ocean. Real quick, in 1932, the Florida East Coast Railway ends, which basically means the end of Manhattan Beach. The Beaches Museum a couple of years ago had an associate director, Brittany Cohill, who did a remarkable job of creating an exhibit about the history of Manhattan Beach. If you go to the Beaches Museum's website, you can learn far more about Manhattan Beach. If you ever go to Hanna Park, it's like the last access in Hanna Park. There's a new state plaque talking about the history of Manhattan Beach. But Manhattan Beach dies, but in 1935, American Beach in Nassau County is created, and black people in Jacksonville, because they're segregated out of Duval County beaches, now start going to Nassau County to American Beach. And there is what Manhattan Beach used to look like. Here is a ticket for a train, Manhattan Beach, exclusively for colored people, round-trip tickets sold daily. And here as late as the 1950s, Jacksonville Beach was always on guard for the possibility that there would be civil rights protesters attempting to integrate the sand in the ocean. And so panic would oftentimes rise during weekends like the 4th of July. And so this would persist until the 1960s. Abraham Lincoln Lewis, the man who helps Florida's first black millionaire. He ran the Afro-American Insurance Company in Jacksonville. He buys up the land here in southern Nassau County for American Beach. All right, so now we're going to finish up by talking about the Civil Rights era, the beginning of the breakdown of this system. And it really begins in World War II. World War II is this pivot point, both in the history of Jacksonville and then in the nation in terms of a new civil rights movement. And in many ways, World War II is this pivot point because for many black people in America, more than 1 million black men and women served in the military during World War II or in some capacity connected with the war effort, that many people began to say, this war needs to be a war in which the United States defeats fascism and Hitler's brand of white supremacy overseas, but it also needs to be a victory against that here at home. It needs to be a victory against Jim Crow. If we're going to fight and potentially sacrifice our lives for the nation abroad, we believe that the United States military should be desegregated. Public facilities in America should be desegregated. All people who are qualified to vote should have that right to vote, that America should be the democracy that it proclaims to be on paper. And so World War II energizes many people to get involved in fighting to bring democracy home here in the United States as well. And in Jacksonville, this takes a couple of different forms. On one hand, at the national level, a former Jacksonville resident named A. Philip Randolph. He went to the Cookman Institute here in Jacksonville, grew up in Jacksonville before leaving in a process known as the Great Migration. A. Philip Randolph, during World War II, I'll talk about this one in just a little bit, he organized a march on Washington, or a potential march on Washington in the 1940s, early in the war. He, along with other religious and political leaders, was pressuring President Roosevelt to desegregate defense industry jobs. Defense industry jobs, along with the military, was segregated, and A. Philip Randolph threatened this mass protest in Washington in 1941, and President Roosevelt did not want a mass protest early, the United States is not yet in the war, but during World War II. And so in order to stop that protest from happening, Roosevelt agrees to desegregate defense industry jobs. And A. Philip Randolph, this former Jacksonville native and resident, he establishes this precedent of at least organizing mass protest marches on a national level to force the federal government to change laws. And of course, that will eventually result in the March on Washington in 1963. It was in many ways the brainchild of A. Philip Randolph. And so that, again, Jacksonville connection. Also in the 1940s, we see others in Jacksonville beginning to use the church once again to fight for greater democracy in the city. This man is Pastor Dallas Graham. He was a pastor at Mount Ararat Baptist Church. And he and a man named Theodore Redding, they began to challenge the state of Florida and Jacksonville's laws denying black people a voice in politics and elections. And they actually take the state of Florida to federal court to end the all-white primary. They began to challenge the all-white primary, and they began to organize and register large numbers of black voters who are now being gathered into clubs called the Roosevelt Democrat Clubs. It's interesting, why would Southern black voters want to be associated with a political party, the Democratic Party, that effectively excluded them for generations? Well, during this time, you had a northern wing of the party that was becoming increasingly, quote, progressive in addressing potential issues like civil rights, as Franklin Roosevelt did to some degree. And so they are aligning with that northern wing of the Democratic Party. Thus, they're calling themselves the Roosevelt Democrats. And so you begin to see the seeds of a kind of civil rights movement here in the 40s with people like Dallas Graham of Mount Ararat Baptist Church. Throughout the 50s, this continues, and we begin to see protests led by people like Frank Hampton. In 1959, they're not only challenging the denial of voting rights for African Americans, but they're beginning to challenge segregation in city facilities, city municipal facilities. We're beginning to see protests against the segregation of the Gator Bowl, the segregation of Jacksonville's municipal golf courses. And so we're seeing the seeds here of a civil rights movement. And it's interesting, Jacksonville, rather than desegregate its golf courses, chooses to sell them to a private owner so that they don't have to desegregate their public golf courses. And so this continues. I know I'm picking up some steam here, but I want to get us right up to 1964. 1 year later, Jacksonville sees its sit-in movement begin. Students, primarily junior high school and high school students, begin to participate in a sit-in movement. That is, they're going downtown and they're challenging segregation in downtown stores, particularly in stores like Woolworth's, Crest. Many of y'all perhaps remember these stores that were downtown, and many other cities had them. Stores that always had lunch counters attached to them where you could not only shop, but it's like a Waffle House attached to a Target. And so the young people would say, when we go to these stores downtown and we buy books and materials for school or even clothes, the stores will take our money. But when we ask to be served at the lunch counter, they tell us we cannot be served here. And so they were trying to highlight that discrepancy. And so this is a man named Rodney Hurst, who is still alive today. This is a man named Alton Yates, who served in the Air Force and later became a major city and political leader, who himself is also still alive today. And they are sitting in, this is the beginning of the sit-in movement in Jacksonville. This is a local newspaper journalist asking about what they're doing. And this, of course, will culminate in a couple weeks at what becomes known as Axe Handle Saturday in Jacksonville. But I want to call your attention to the fact that it was once again a Presbyterian church that was the spiritual heart of the sit-in movement. Before the youth, and this was primarily a youth-led movement, before they went downtown, they would come to Laura Street Presbyterian Church to pray. At the church, they taught themselves or were taught how to practice nonviolence, that this was non-negotiable. You had to, in effect, be absolutely nonviolent, despite the fact it was almost inevitable you were going to face some sort of physical retaliation for what you were doing. And so Laura Street Presbyterian, which was basically at Laura and Union, was the gathering place, and then they would go and march downtown. And then on August 27th, 1960, a group of men associated with a new Ku Klux Klan organization comes into the city and begins to terrorize anyone who was participating in that particular event or later who had black skin. And this becomes, by August 1960, what one national newspaper said, the worst racial outbreak in the nation since the Little Rock school integration of 1957, when there was a riot over the integration of Little Rock High School in 1957. The news was picked up. National television was here. Life magazine was here. And Jacksonville became ground zero for the civil rights movement by 1960. If you can't see it, this is a photograph of Axe Handle Saturday and one of the victims of one of the men wielding an axe that was published in Life magazine. Again, the central role of churches, it wasn't just Laura Street Presbyterian Church, it was Bethel Baptist Church and other surrounding churches, Shiloh Metropolitan, St. Stephen's AME, St. Paul AME. Again, mass meetings were held in these churches to galvanize the community, to bring support, but to also to remind people that this was an extension of their discipleship. It was not something separate from it. It was central to it. And in many ways, once again, we think of this political movement as in many ways a kind of religious revival of living out one's Christian faith, which also raises the question, where was the white church in Jacksonville? A very small number of pastors felt comfortable or brave enough to come out and show some degree of muted support, but they did that as individuals rather than representatives of their church or denomination. The consequences for joining this would have been grave to most established church pastors in Jacksonville. You were basically going to perhaps alienate your entire congregation had you demonstrated that kind of support. I know that there was recently a documentary about the role of Presbyterian ministers in the civil rights movement. I unfortunately didn't get to see that, but at least in Jacksonville, it was a decided minority of people who felt like they had an obligation because of their faith to take the side of people fighting for dignity and justice. All right, I'm going to just very quickly get us to 1964 and finish and ask if you have any questions. So 1964 is a turning point year in the history of Jacksonville. First off, if you recall, last week I said because of the efforts of people like Jonathan Gibbs and Northern missionaries and the Methodist and Presbyterian churches who were emphasizing education and the establishment of an accessible educational system in Jacksonville, that by 1900, Jacksonville had the highest literacy rate of any city in the South. And then I said last week, by 1964, Jacksonville, I should say Duval County, ranks 67th out of 67 counties in how much money its taxpayers pay to support public education. It had the worst public education system in the state of Florida by 1964, and in 1964, its 15 high schools are disaccredited because of poor funding, poor teacher compensation, frequent teacher turnover, poor infrastructure in schools, as my mom can attest when she was at Robert E. Lee. It was a city that basically forsook its youth for other priorities. 1964 is also important because it's the first year that Jacksonville, in a very small way, attempts to integrate its public schools. And in consequence of that, less than half of 1% of Black students actually integrated Jacksonville's public schools that year. But in 1964, Donald Godfrey and his mother was brave and sends him to formerly all-white Lackawanna Elementary. And as a result, the Ku Klux Klan found out where he lived and bombed his house. Half of his house was lost. They were on the other side of the house and thus did not die. But it becomes, once again, a pivotal moment here. But also because in 1964, a new phase of the civil rights movement breaks out, and civil rights leaders are trying to end segregation finally in downtown businesses. And they are marching daily. It is a movement led by the youth and Black pastors. This is a photograph of Baptist ministers at Bethel Baptist. This is a man named Rutledge Pearson, who was the president of the local NAACP. And they are leaving the church, going downtown to protest. But then Mayor Hayden Burns, who was the mayor at the time, outlaws any protest downtown. He deputizes the fire department so that they have police powers to help the police arrest protesters downtown. And he's doing all of this because he's running for governor, and he does not want to appear soft on civil rights. He doesn't want to negotiate. He doesn't want to appear weak on civil rights. And so he wants to take a strong law and order stance. And he is one of the first politicians to use that phrase, law and order. And he says, I'm restoring law and order in Jacksonville. I'll restore law and order in Florida. We're not going to have protesters in our city. This only inflames tensions, and it leads to outbreaks of riots and friction, which culminates in March of 1964 in the death of a woman named Johnny Mae Chappelle, a Black woman who was targeted by a group of white men because for no other reason than she was black. She was killed as a reaction against the protests that were going on. A major turning point. But I'll fast forward, and this is where I'll end. In the summer of 1964, those of you who are alive will remember this, Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. Now the federal government has said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race or later sex and religion in how you choose who you hire in your businesses, who you serve in your businesses. Segregation laws now violate federal law and the 64 Civil Rights Act, but still the city of Jacksonville refused to relent, and they maintained segregated businesses, and they maintained a segregated Gator Bowl until September of 1964, and it's not the federal government's dictate that ends segregation in Jacksonville, but it's a concert. Does anyone know what happened in Jacksonville on September 11th, 1964 that ends segregation? The Beatles come to Jacksonville. And it is Paul McCartney and John Lennon who say, we will not play in a segregated Gator Bowl. And it was the public relations prospect, this possibility that Jacksonville was to become front and center, national news of a city that would not abide by the Civil Rights Act and could not have the Beatles in their first American tour play in the city because they insisted on having a segregated facility. So city officials said, okay, we'll end segregation at the Gator Bowl, and thus the Beatles agreed to play in Jacksonville when they were about to refuse to play in the city. And this, by the way, was one day after Hurricane Dora. And my mom lived through Hurricane Dora. I don't know if anyone else was in Jacksonville in September of 1964, but the worst hurricane to come through our area in generations, and we haven't had that kind of hurricane in our area since. My mother-in-law, Phyllis Towsey, apparently tells a story of climbing a fence to get into the Gator Bowl to see the Beatles, even though she didn't have a ticket. Is that right? Something like that. So, I always find it fascinating. It was not following one's moral conscience that led Hayden Burns and city leaders to do away with segregation. It was not a federal law that ended segregation in Jacksonville. It was John Lennon and Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr and George Harrison who said, we will not play here unless you desegregate. All right, that is it. I know I went long, but I will be happy to answer any questions. Jeff?
I've met a few people in a conference I went to this past week who are on staff at the Bethel Baptist Church, and they said there's a room or a building behind the church or something where you can take tours of all this history.
Yeah.
I think that might be a great opportunity
Yeah.
for someone to go down.
Absolutely.
I just might add that in approximately 1969, I was plant manager here in Brunswick, Georgia,
Ah,
and it was my responsibility to integrate. We had to have a certain number of blacks representing the area that we lived in, and we had segregated bathrooms, and we needed to integrate that. I want to insert that the people that resisted that integration bathrooms was the blacks because they kept their bathrooms clean and the whites didn't. So there was that resistance. The blacks, they wore their street clothes into work and changed into work clothes, whereas the white guys, they just wore the same clothes and their bathroom was a mess.
that's a really good point, Jake, because that was also an issue with school integration. There was a desire, of course, to end school segregation, but black people oftentimes did not like the fact that school integration meant black students going into formerly all-white schools. The burden was oftentimes placed on them. They liked their schools. They liked their teachers. They liked that they were community schools. And so there was oftentimes this irony involved. Absolutely. It was not the reverse. Yes, sir?
In 55, the train station here had whites only drinking fountains. When did they do away with that?
In 1964. And there's a really good documentary if you want to search it, if you're used to using YouTube, and maybe I can get this sent out to the church can put it out. But there's a documentary called Axe Handle Saturday Remembered. And there are city employees who talk about segregated, not just businesses downtown, but water fountains downtown.